I remember that night with a clarity that haunts me as if it were burned into my mind. It all started as a typical outing with friends looking for some fun in the cold streets of our city. Winter had fallen hard that year, and the nights were especially freezing. We had met at the usual bar where warmth and laughter filled the air, momentarily distancing us from the harsh reality of the outside. There were 4 of us, John, Michael, Peter, and I. We had known each other since childhood, and even though our lives had taken different paths, we still found time for these nocturnal escapades. That particular night, John was especially lively, perhaps because of the excess of alcohol he had consumed. He was the most reckless of the group, always looking for ways to attract attention and make others laugh, regardless of the consequences. We left the bar around midnight, and the streets were deserted. The freezing wind blew hard, and the echo of our footsteps resonated in the empty buildings. We headed toward a small park where we usually went to end the night sharing stories and cigarettes. It was then that we saw the homeless man sitting on a bench, wrapped in a threadbare and dirty blanket. His long and tangled hair fell over his face, hiding his features in shadows. Only the shine of his dark eyes could be seen, observing us with a disturbing intensity. John, with his usual recklessness, approached the homeless man with a mocking smile. "Look at this poor man," he said, pointing at the man. "You're cold, old man. Do you want some of our drink to warm you up?" The homeless man didn't answer. He just continued staring at him. The atmosphere became tense, and a feeling of discomfort took hold of us. I tried to stop John, but he was determined to continue with his cruel entertainment. "Come on, don't be like that," insisted John, shaking the bottle in front of the man. "We're just trying to help you." Suddenly, the homeless man stood up. His movement was so fast and fluid that it surprised us all. We stood paralyzed, watching as he stood up and removed the blanket, revealing a thin but strong body. His eyes shone with a ferocity that we had not seen before. "You don't need to help me," he said, the homeless man with a deep, resonant voice. "But you, boy, need to learn to respect others." John laughed, but it sounded forced and nervous. There was no trace of the initial amusement in his eyes. Instead, he looked scared, although he tried to hide it. "And what are you going to do about it?" John replied. Although his voice trembled slightly, the homeless man did not respond. He simply raised a hand and pointed at John. A shiver ran down my spine, and I knew something terrible was about to happen. I tried to move, but my body did not respond. It was as if an invisible force kept me immobile, forcing me to witness what was going to happen. John began to laugh again, but this time his laughter turned into a cry of pain. He fell to his knees, holding his head with both hands. His screams were unbearable, filling the air with a sinister echo. I felt the world crumble around us, and an inexplicable darkness enveloped the park. Michael and Peter tried to help John, but they were also stopped by that invisible force. We could only watch helplessly while John writhed on the ground, his eyes filled with terror. The vagrant approached slowly, and each step he took seemed to echo in my mind like a hammer striking hot iron. "Remember this, boy," said the vagrant, his voice echoing in the darkness. "Never make fun of those who seem helpless. The consequences can be more terrifying than you imagine." With those words, the vagrant turned around and disappeared into the night, leaving John lying on the ground, panting and shaking. The force that kept us immobile disappeared, and we ran to our friend. He was pale, and his eyes were empty, as if his soul had been ripped from his body. We took him to the hospital, but the doctors could not find any explanation for his condition. John was left in a state of shock, unable to speak or move. The days turned into weeks, and his condition did not improve. Michael, Peter, and I tried to move on with our lives, but the shadow of that night never left us. One night, while I was alone in my apartment, I received a call. It was Peter. His voice was shaking with fear. "You have to come," he said, almost in a whisper. "Something has happened to Michael." I arrived at Michael's house as quickly as I could. The door was half open, and the interior was plunged into an eerie darkness. I called for Michael, but there was no answer. I entered cautiously, and the smell of blood and fear hit me immediately. I found Michael in his bedroom. He was sitting on the floor with his eyes wide open and fixed on the wall. There were marks on his arms, as if he had tried to defend himself from something invisible. Peter was at his side, pale and trembling. "I don't know what happened," Peter said, his voice broken. "I found him like this when I came to visit him." I looked at Michael, and the horror in his eyes reminded me of John. It seemed like something had haunted him to the point of madness. I tried to talk to him, but he didn't answer. He only murmured incoherences, whispering about eyes that watched him from the darkness. We called an ambulance, and the paramedics took him away. But I knew it was too late. Whatever had attacked John had reached Michael, too. That night, while I was trying to sleep, I felt a presence in my room. I opened my eyes and saw a shadow in the corner. Fear paralyzed me, and I could only watch as the shadow moved towards me. I felt an icy cold envelop me, and a voice whispered in my ear, "You too will pay for your disrespect." I woke up startled, covered in cold sweat. The dream had been so vivid. I could still feel the freezing breath on my skin. I knew it wasn't just a nightmare. Something dark and evil was after us, and it wouldn't stop until it had destroyed us all. The next few weeks were torture. Each night, the presence in my room grew stronger. I could hear whispers and see shadows moving in the darkness. My health began to deteriorate, and each day I felt weaker and more exhausted. My friends and family tried to help me, but they couldn't see what I saw. I was alone in my fight against this invisible force. One night, as I tried to stay awake, I felt a cold hand on my shoulder. I turned quickly, but no one was there. Fear turned to panic, and I knew I couldn't stay in my apartment. I ran out into the street, looking for shelter anywhere that could offer me a little safety. I ended up in a small church at the end of the street. It was an unassuming place, but I felt a sense of peace as I entered. The priest, an old man with a kind look, greeted me and offered me shelter. I told him everything that had happened, and although his eyes showed compassion, he also saw a shadow of concern. "What you describe is an ancient evil," said the priest after listening to my story. "Something that cannot be fought with willpower alone. We need to ask for divine help." That night, the priest and I prayed together. I felt a peace that I had not experienced in a long time, and for the first time, I was able to sleep without being tormented by nightmares. But I knew that the fight was not over. Whatever was chasing us would not give up so easily. The next morning, I decided to return to the park where it all had begun. I was hoping to find some clue, something that could help us stop this horror. The park was deserted, and the bench where we had seen the homeless man was covered in snow. I approached, looking for any sign of his presence. Suddenly, I felt a presence behind me. I turned slowly, and there was the homeless man, watching me with his dark and penetrating eyes. His expression was severe, and I could feel the weight of his gaze. "Why are you doing this?" I asked, my voice trembling. The homeless man did not answer immediately. He approached slowly, and his presence seemed to absorb all the light around him. "Because your friends did not respect what they could not understand," he said finally. "And now they must pay for their arrogance." "But I did nothing," I protested. "I tried to stop them." The tramp looked at me with a mixture of pity and harshness. "The fault is not always of a single person. We are all responsible for our actions and those around us. The only way to stop this is to face it with humility and repentance." I felt a wave of despair. I did not know how to face something I could not see or touch, but the tramp gave me a little hope. "Look inside yourself," he said. "Find peace and humility. Only then can you free yourself from this darkness." With those words, the tramp disappeared, leaving me alone in the cold park. I knew I had to do something, but I was not sure where to start. I went back to the church and told the priest what had happened. He suggested I make a confession and ask for forgiveness for our sins. That night, in the solitude of the church, I knelt down before I had done so. I asked for forgiveness for my friend's actions and for my own lack of intervention. I felt a sense of liberation, as if a heavy burden was lifted from my shoulders. The following days were difficult, but little by little, the dark presence began to fade. John and Michael were still hospitalized but showing signs of improvement. Peter and I continued to visit them, and together we tried to rebuild our lives. We learned a painful and terrifying lesson. Never underestimate the power of the unknown and always treat others with respect, no matter their appearance or circumstances. The consequences of arrogance and lack of responsiveness can be truly terrifying. If you're enjoying the video, please subscribe the channel for future videos and like and share with your friends. I am a vagabond. I was not always one, but life has cruel ways of changing people's course. A few years ago, I lost my job, my home, and eventually my family. With nowhere to go, I ended up on the streets, wandering from place to place, looking for shelter and something to eat. It is in this desperation where my story truly begins. In a hostile refuge where I witnessed horrors that still haunt me in my darkest nightmares, the refuge had no name, at least not an official one. We who occupied it called it the Fortress, a wry name considering it was anything but a fortress. It was an abandoned factory with broken windows and leaky roofs, but it offered some shelter from the cold and rain, and that was enough to draw those like me who had nowhere else to go. From the moment I arrived, something felt off. The other vagabonds were more reserved than I expected. There was a palpable tension in the air, a sense of impending danger that made my hair stand on end. I didn't know anyone there, but I soon realized there was an unofficial hierarchy. The strongest and most ruthless ruled, while the weakest kept quiet, trying not to draw attention to themselves. The first night in the fortress was unsettling. I curled up in a corner, trying to sleep despite the cold and the hunger that twisted my insides. The silence was occasionally interrupted by whispers and moans from other occupants. At some point, I heard a muffled scream followed by a deathly silence. I didn't dare move or open my eyes. I knew that whatever had caused that scream, I didn't want anyone to see it. The next morning, one of the men I had seen the night before was gone. I asked some of the other homeless people, but they all looked at me suspiciously and walked away without saying a word. Something was terribly wrong, but I couldn't put my finger on what it was. That night, fear kept me awake. I watched the others, noticing how some of them seemed especially nervous. It was as if they were waiting for something, an event they knew would happen but couldn't prevent. Eventually, sleep overcame me, but it didn't last long. I woke up suddenly hearing strange noises. They were wet sounds, as if someone was chewing hard. Around me, the others seemed to be fast asleep, or at least pretending to be. The sound was coming from a dark corner of the factory. My curiosity mixed with fear made me slowly get up and approach. What I saw made my blood run cold. A group of men were gathered around something on the ground. At first, I couldn't see what it was, but the metallic smell of blood hit me immediately. With horror, I watched as one of the men picked up a piece of raw meat and brought it to his mouth, chewing with relish. I realized then what I was seeing. They were eating one of their own. I backed away silently, trying not to make any noise that would draw their attention. My mind refused to process what I had just witnessed. How was it possible? Hunger can drive people to do terrible things, but this was more than just hunger. A sick pleasure in their actions, a veracity that was inhuman. I knew I had to get out of there. If I stayed, it was only a matter of time before I became their next victim. I waited until dawn. As daylight began to filter through the broken windows, the others began to wake up, but no one mentioned what had happened the night before. It was as if it were an unspoken secret, something everyone had but no one talked about. I took the first chance I had to escape. I pretended I was going to get some food, knowing I wouldn't be back. I walked until my legs couldn't take it anymore, moving me as far away from the fortress as possible. The idea of what I had left behind haunted me, but at least I was free of that cursed place. I found another shelter, this one a little more organized and less sinister, but the images of that one wouldn't leave me alone. I tried to talk to some people about what I had seen, but they all looked at me with skepticism or fear. Eventually, I met an older man who listened to me attentively. He told me stories of cannibalism in times of desperation, but what I described went beyond simple survival. He told me about an ancient curse, a dark ritual that condemned participants to an insatiable hunger. According to him, those who had resorted to cannibalism in the fortress had not done so only out of necessity. They had been drawn by an evil power, something that had remained latent in that place. I decided to return a long time ago. I knew it was crazy, but I needed to understand what had really happened. I needed to face those who had fallen into darkness. When I returned, the atmosphere was even more tense. The faces of the vagabonds were pale, marked by hunger and fear. I waited out the night, hiding in the shadows, watching. I saw them prepare as the group gathered once again. This time, I wasn't the only witness. Another young and scared man watched them too. When they tried to catch him, he ran to me, asking for help. I knew we couldn't face them directly, so I opted for the only thing I could do: set the place on fire. We got a couple of cans of gas from an abandoned car and sprayed the perimeter as we set it on fire. Screams of horror filled the air. The vagabonds, trapped by their own madness, couldn't escape in time. The fortress burned with a purifying fervor, consuming everything in its path. I survived, but the scars of that experience never left me. The faces of those in agony, the looks of the devourers. Everything is etched in my mind. Now I live with the weight of what I saw and what I did. Sometimes, when I close my eyes, I can hear the whispers and screams of the fortress, and I wonder if I'll ever truly escape this nightmare. This story is not just a warning of the horrors that can unleash hunger and desperation. It's a reminder that in the darkest corners of humanity, there are things that defy understanding, and that sometimes the real monster isn't something external but what we carry inside. I don't know if I should be writing this, but I feel like I have to before it's too late. My name doesn't matter. What does matter is what's been chasing me. That feeling that something or someone is behind me, watching me, waiting for the right moment to pounce. It all started a few months ago. I clearly remember the first time I saw the old woman. It was a gray day, like almost every day in this city. The wind blew dry leaves through the dirty streets, and the morning mist seemed to have stuck to the walls of the buildings, as if trying to suffocate any glimpse of life. I didn't have a fixed place to sleep. I just stayed in any corner I found. I wandered aimlessly, looking for something, anything that would help me survive one more day. Desperation had become a constant companion. On one of those days, I came to a dumpster on the outskirts of the city. It wasn't the first time I had looked for food among the rubble, but that place had something different, something that made my hair stand on end. The piles of garbage seemed higher, darker, as if they were not only hiding waste but something much worse. But hunger pushed me to continue forward. While I rummaged through the filth, I heard a crunch behind me. I turned quickly, and there she was, an old woman, hunched over with skin tanned by time and eyes sunken into sockets that seemed empty. She had disheveled gray hair and was wearing rags that were once colored but were now nothing more than dark and dirty rags. She was so focused on rummaging through the garbage that she didn't notice my presence. Or at least that's what I thought. I approached slowly, thinking about asking her for some food, but when I was a few meters from her, she suddenly raised her head. Her eyes, darker than I had ever seen in another human being, pierced my soul. I remained frozen in place, unable to move or say a word. "You're hungry, boy," she said with a voice cracked like the crunch of dry leaves underfoot. I nodded, unable to articulate a word, with an exasperating slowness. The old woman put her hand in one of the piles of garbage and took out something wrapped in a cloth. She carefully undid it and offered me what was inside. An amulet, a small object made of bones and skin, deformed and unpleasant to the sight. I didn't know what to say. It wasn't food that I needed, but the amulet seemed to have some important meaning for her. "Take it with you," she said, bringing it closer to me, "or something terrible will happen to you." I took it without thinking too much, just so she would leave me alone. I didn't want to offend her, and at that moment, I just wanted to leave as quickly as possible. I nodded again and turned around to leave. I felt her gaze fixed on my back as I walked away. I didn't want to turn around. I couldn't bear the idea of seeing those eyes again. I continued on my way, trying to forget what had happened. I threw the amulet in the first alley I passed. I didn't want to carry something so repulsive, but since that night, everything changed. Sleeping wasn't easy for me, but that first night after the encounter with the old woman was worse than any other. I felt a presence, something heavy in the air. I could hear the sound of my own breathing so loud it almost hurt my ears. I closed my eyes, but I couldn't disconnect. There was something in the darkness, something that was watching me. I convinced myself that it was just my imagination, a product of the fear I felt for having accepted the amulet. But as the days passed, that sensation only intensified. Every night it was the same, no matter where I tried to sleep. I always felt the same. First a pressure in my chest, as if something invisible was resting on me, then a cold sensation on the back of my neck, as if someone was blowing softly from the darkness. But the worst was the whisper, barely audible, as if it came from very far away, but clear enough to freeze my blood. I couldn't understand the words, if there were any, but the tone was unmistakable. It was a threat. I tried to ignore it at first, convincing myself that I was losing my mind, that hunger and desperation were playing tricks on me. But one night, while I was trying to rest in an abandoned shelter, I saw something that made me doubt my sanity. I was lying on the ground, wrapped in the little I had to protect myself from the cold, when I felt the familiar chill on the back of my neck. I stayed motionless, paralyzed by fear, and then I saw it. A dark figure, barely discernible in the gloom. It was standing across the room, watching me. I couldn't see its face, but I knew it was there. Its presence was so intense I could almost touch it. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out of my mouth. I wanted to move, but my body wouldn't respond. All I could do was stand there, staring at that thing, waiting for it to do something, anything. But it didn't move. It didn't say anything. I just stood there, watching. Finally, after what seemed like hours, I fell asleep, exhausted from fear. When I woke up, the figure was gone, but the feeling of its presence remained. I couldn't shake it off. I couldn't stop thinking about what I had seen, what it meant. I decided then that I had to get the amulet back. I don't know why. Maybe a part of me believed that having it back could stop what was happening. I went back to the alley where I had thrown it, but it wasn't there. Urgently, among the trash, desperate, but I found nothing. I felt lost, condemned. That night, I saw the figure again. It was closer this time. I could see her silhouette more clearly, but I still couldn't make out her face. However, there was something different. A smell, a putrid stench like rotting flesh invaded the room. I fought the urge to vomit but couldn't look away from the thing. My body shook uncontrollably, but I was completely still, trapped in that paralyzing fear. The days turned into weeks, and each night the figure was closer. I couldn't help it. I couldn't escape from her. I began to wander the city in search of the old woman. I needed answers. I needed to understand what was happening. I asked other homeless people. I described the old woman in detail, but no one had seen her. It was as if she didn't exist, as if she had been just a figment of my imagination. But I knew that wasn't the case. I knew she had something to do with this. One night, when the figure was so close I could almost feel her breath, something inside me broke. Fear consumed me completely. I let myself be carried away by it. I screamed until my voice went blank. I jumped up and ran, aimlessly, not knowing where to go. I just wanted to get away from that thing. I ran until my legs couldn't go on any longer, until the pain in my chest was unbearable. I fell to my knees in the middle of a deserted street, gasping for air, crying, completely defeated. And there, in the darkness, I heard a sound that froze my blood. A laugh, a low, cultural laugh coming from everywhere and nowhere at the same time. I jumped up, looking frantically around me, but there was no one. The laughter continued to echo in my head, mocking my desperation. I covered my ears, trying to block it out, but it was useless. And then I saw it. A few meters away from me in the darkness, the figure was standing motionless, watching me once again. But this time, its face was visible. It was the face of the old woman. An indescribable terror took hold of me. I tried to move, but my legs didn't respond. I felt the figure slowly approaching, each step echoing in my ears like the beat of a drum. Its laughter grew louder, more penetrating, until I felt like it would break my skull. I don't know how, but I managed to move. I jumped up and ran again, without direction, without destination. I ran until my lungs burned, until the laughter disappeared, until the sun began to appear on the horizon. I collapsed, exhausted, my body and mind at the edge of collapse. Since then, I haven't seen the figure again, but its presence is still there, always lurking in the shadows. I know it's only a matter of time before it catches me. I know that whatever that old woman gave me has doomed me. There is no escape, there is no redemption. Now, as I write this, I feel that familiar chill on the back of my neck. I know it's close. I know it's coming for me soon. I don't know how much longer I can hold out. I just wanted to leave a record of what happened to me, what's happening to me, seeing maybe if someone else meets that old woman, they can avoid my fate, because I know that what awaits me is something much worse than death. My life has become a series of gray days and cold nights, always in search of a place to sleep and something to eat. I wasn't always like this. There was a time when I had a family, a job, and a home. But bad decisions, the loss of my job, and a series of misfortunes left me with nothing. Living on the streets, forgotten by the world. One night I was sitting in a dark corner of the city with an empty stomach and a heart full of despair. The rain was falling without cease, and my soaked clothes only increased my misery. I looked up at the sky, begging God for a miracle, but I felt my pleas falling on deaf ears. It was at that moment, in my darkest hour, when a man appeared with a dark coat and a hat that hid much of his face. He approached me with a smile that froze my blood. He extended his hand and, with a soft and persuasive voice, he said to me, "Are you tired of being like this? I can help you become a rich and powerful person. You just have to give me your soul." In my desperation, I didn't know what to think, but I was so tired of my misery that, without thinking twice, I accepted his offer. We closed the deal with a handshake, and at that moment, I felt a dark and cold energy run through my body. I didn't know until later that I had sealed my destiny with a curse. I had to give up souls, kill others like me, to prevent the devil from claiming mine. At first, the promise of wealth and power seemed like a blessing, but I soon discovered the horror of my decision. The first homeless man I killed was a man I had known for years. His eyes looked at me in disbelief as I took his life away. I couldn't believe what I had done, and the guilt began to consume me. Every night, the man in the dark coat would come back to remind me of my debt. He would whisper in my ear as I slept, but each murder only plunged me deeper into darkness. My soul was filled with an insatiable void, and the fear of losing my own life pushed me to move on. The months passed, and my wealth grew, but with each death, my humanity faded. I began to see shadows in every corner, to hear voices in the night accusing me of my crimes. Paranoia took over me, and soon I realized that I could not escape my destiny. One night, as I slept in a luxurious bed, I had a terrifying dream. I saw the man in the dark coat surrounded by the souls of those he had killed. All of them looked at me with hatred and sadness, and their screams of agony filled the air. I woke up sweating, with my heart beating hard. I knew that time was running out. If I did not give up more souls, the devil would come for mine. I tried to run away, escape the city and my destiny, but no matter where I went, the man in the dark coat always found me. His presence was a constant reminder of my pact. Hellish guilt and fear consumed me, and I soon realized that I couldn't go on living like this. One day, I decided to face the devil. I returned to the place where we had met, hoping to find a way to break the pact. But instead, the man in the dark coat appeared with a cruel smile on his face. "Do you think you can escape your destiny?" he told me. "You made a deal, and now you must fulfill it, or you will suffer the consequences." At that moment, I understood that there was no escape. The only way to free my soul was to accept my destiny and face the consequences of my actions. I knelt on the ground, begging for forgiveness, but I knew it was too late. I had crossed a line that I could not undo. The man in the dark coat approached and placed a hand on my shoulder. I felt a cold, dark energy invade my body, and I knew my time had come. As darkness enveloped me, I saw the faces of those I had killed. Their empty eyes and their screams of agony accompanied me as I descended into the abyss. This is my story, a story of despair, guilt, and terror. I am a wanderer who made the worst decision of his life, and now I live in constant fear that the devil will come for my soul. If you ever find yourself in a similar situation, remember my story and think twice before making a pact with the dark forces, because there is nothing more terrifying than losing your humanity and your soul in the process. Since that fateful day, my life became a spiral of horror and despair. Every night, while the world slept, I wandered the dark streets in search of my victims. The city, with its shadowy corners and dark alleys, became my home. Fear and paranoia had taken over my mind. Every shadow seemed a threat, every sound a harbinger of my doom. The voices of those I had killed filled my head, their screams of agony echoing in my ears. I couldn't escape them no matter where I went. One night, as I walked through a deserted park, I saw a woman sitting on a bench. Her clothes were dirty and worn, and her gaze lost in the distance. I knew she was one of mine, a potential victim, but when I got closer, something in her eyes stopped me. It was a look of deep sadness, a sadness that reflected my own. I tried to get away, but the man in the dark coat suddenly appeared as if out of nowhere. His cruel smile made me shudder. "You are afraid," he whispered in my ear. "Remember your pact. You must deliver souls, or yours will be mine." The pressure was unbearable. I felt my mind fracture under the weight of guilt and fear. But at that moment, the woman on the bench looked up and looked me straight in the eyes. "Why are you doing this?" she asked me with a weak but firm voice. "What has led you to this darkness?" Her question pierced me like a dagger. I had no answer. I only knew that I had fallen into an abyss from which I could not escape. But her words awakened something in me, a spark of humanity that I thought was lost. The man in the dark coat came closer. "There is no choice," he said. "You must fulfill your part of the deal." But at that moment, something changed inside me. The look of the woman, her sadness and compassion, gave me the strength to face my fear. I turned to the man in the dark coat, determined not to let him control me anymore. "I won't," I said firmly. "I prefer to face my destiny than to continue being your puppet." The man in the dark coat became enraged. His face transformed into a mask of anger and hate. "Then you will pay with your soul," he screamed, and suddenly, I felt an indescribable pain run through my body. I fell to the ground, convulsing in pain. The darkness enveloped me, and I knew that my time had come. But in that last moment, I felt a strange peace. I had made the right decision. I had recovered my humanity, even if it was only for a brief moment. While the darkness consumed me, I saw the figure of the woman fade in the distance. Her look of sadness turned into one of understanding and forgiveness, and I knew that despite everything, I had found a form of redemption in the midst of darkness. My story is a warning. There are no shortcuts in life that do not have a price, and when you make a pact with the dark forces, you will always pay with your soul. Not always did I live on the streets. There was a time when I had a house, a stable job, and even a car. I had a beautiful wife who loved me. However, all that fell apart because of my alcoholism and my addiction to gambling. I fell into a well so deep that I no longer saw the light of day. My wife, tired of enduring my relapses and my empty promises, ended up leaving me. That was the final blow. The life that once was full of purpose and direction fell apart like a house of cards. I ended up in the streets, wandering aimlessly with the only company of my dark thoughts. Thoughts that became more and more insidious as night fell. Months passed, maybe years. I'm not sure. Time became a blur when the only thing that mattered was finding a place to sleep and something to drink. My nights were filled with disturbing dreams and, worse still, the brutal reality that woke me up every morning. The bridges, with their permanent shadow and their promise of loneliness, became my favorite refuge. There was one in particular, a bridge known for the tragedies that surrounded it. People said that those who slept there could hear the screams of those who had thrown themselves into the void. I didn't believe in those stories. I took them as old wives' tales to scare children. But I was not a child. I was a broken man, and ghosts were nothing more than a reflection of my own guilt. One night, however, something changed. The cold was more intense than usual, as if something in the air was absorbing all the heat. I curled up under the bridge, wrapped in the few layers of dirty clothes I had, and closed my eyes, hoping that sleep would take me away, even for a few hours, from the misery of my existence. But sleep did not come. Instead, a feeling of restlessness began to creep across my skin, as if someone was watching me. I tried to ignore it, telling myself that it was just my mind playing tricks on me, that the insomnia and the cold were making my imagination run wild. But then I heard a heartbreaking cry coming from somewhere nearby. I opened my eyes, startled, and sat up slowly. I looked around, but I saw no one. The crying continued to echo off the metal structure of the bridge. It was so painful, so full of despair, that my chest tightened as if something was squeezing my heart. Then I saw a man standing on the edge of the bridge, looking at me. His eyes were empty, dark as the night itself, but I couldn't look away from them. He seemed to be fighting something, an internal battle that consumed him from inside. The crying stopped, but his expression was still one of indescribable anguish. "Please help me," he said, his voice barely a whisper. I felt a shiver run down my spine. There was something in his tone, the way he looked at me, that made my skin crawl. "I regret. I shouldn't have done it," he continued, extending a trembling hand towards me. It was as if he wanted me to get him out of there, to rescue him somehow. But something was stopping me, an overwhelming feeling of danger. Despite that, I found myself taking a step towards him, feeling the need to help this lost soul. It was then that he launched himself. He was so fast that I didn't have time to scream. I ran towards the edge, but when I got there was no trace of him. I looked down, expecting to see his body falling, crashing against the rocks of the river, but there was nothing, only the emptiness. The cold air hit my face, and my breathing became labored. I was alone, or at least that's what I thought. A voice echoed behind me. "Don't do it," I turned quickly, and there was the same man standing where I had been a few moments before. His expression had changed. It was no longer desperate but cold, almost threatening. "Don't do it," he repeated, approaching slowly. "You will condemn your soul to eternal suffering." His words hit me like a mallet, filling me with a terror I had never experienced before. It was a primal terror, something that was born from the depths of my gut, a fear that paralyzed my limbs. I froze, unable to move or speak. I could only watch as this being, that was clearly not human, came closer and closer. His face began to change, decomposing as if he were falling apart before my eyes. I saw his skin crumble, revealing rotting flesh and broken bones. The stench that emanated was unbearable, a smell of death and decay that made me stagger back with a stone. I fell to the ground, my heart beating with a force that I felt was going to explode in my chest. I closed my eyes tightly, hoping that when I opened them, all this would be nothing more than a nightmare, a hallucination caused by the cold, hunger, and desperation. But when I opened them again, he was still there, watching me. His eyes, or what was left of them, shone with an intensity that I couldn't understand. He leaned towards me, and I could feel his foul breath on my face. "Go away," he whispered to me. "Go away now while you still can." And then he disappeared. He simply vanished into the air as if he had never been there. The night was silent again. The cold returned to my skin, and the only sound I could hear was that of my labored breathing. I don't know how long I lay there on the ground, unable to move, but finally, when the first light of dawn began to appear on the horizon, I found the strength to get up. My body was numb, not only from the cold but from the terror I had experienced. I walked aimlessly away from the bridge, feeling that if I stayed there one more second, something worse could happen. I didn't look back. I didn't want to see that place again or what inhabited it. That morning, I found a shelter for the homeless. They offered me hot food, a bed, and for the first time in a long time, a safe place to sleep. But sleep didn't come easily. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that figure, those empty eyes that looked at me from the edge of the bridge. The days passed, but the experience didn't leave me alone. I finally made the decision to seek help. I knew that if I didn't, that terror would consume me from the inside. I entered a rehabilitation program. I knew I had to rebuild my life from the foundations, and although the road would be long and difficult, I could no longer continue living as I had before. The months that followed were hard. The nights were the worst, filled with nightmares and memories of that night under the bridge. But with time and the help of others, I began to heal slowly. I began to give up alcohol and gambling, and I began to regain some of what I had lost. Today, I am here, still in the process of recovery but stronger than before. I still do not fully understand what I saw that night. I do not know if it was a spirit, a demon, or maybe a manifestation of my own desperation. But one thing is certain, that encounter changed my life. It made me face my own demons and gave me the opportunity to redeem myself, to return to being the person I once was. Sometimes, when the night is especially dark and cold, I feel a presence near me, as if something is watching me. But I am no longer afraid. I know that as long as I keep fighting, as long as I keep searching for redemption, I will be safe. And every day, I strive to live, to find a purpose, to keep going, because I know that I'm not only fighting for my life but for my soul as well. And on that path, the darkness will never claim me again.